Hi everyone, I'm Mono, and today I'll be going over a list of tanks that I want to see in Hell Let Loose. Now, I'm sure everyone knows the Red Army, the Russians, are coming to the game sometime after Update 9, so of course we're gonna get some Russian armor soon, but there's many more tanks that I want to see in the game. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about them and go over whether or not we will ever get to see them in the game. Alright, let's start the list with what's maybe one of the worst tanks to see service in World War II, but it is one of my favorites, and that's the Crusader. The reason why it is one of my favorites is because of the way it looks. It's a pretty modern and cool looking tank. It has a very distinct angled turret design that I think looks really good. The Crusader started service in 1941 and was primarily used in North Africa, though it was deployed in Europe later, where it mainly served a support role as it was completely outclassed by every single tank around it. So of course it goes without saying that the ideal scenario for this tank in Hell Let Loose would be to see this get introduced along with the British Army with some kick-ass Africa maps or scenarios like Tobruk or El Alamein. There are currently no plans to add the British Army into the game, but I think it would be the obvious choice after the introduction of the Eastern Front. However, I think if this ever happens, it would be after the game is out of early access. The Crusader was widely regarded as an underpowered, unreliable, and underarmed tank, which was later replaced with the Shermans and other better, more modern tanks. In fact, the turret design was actually prone to deflect incoming rounds towards the turret ring, which is obviously not something you want to happen, so that's a pretty major design flaw right there. During the war, the Crusader got several upgrades to try and mitigate its shortcomings, such as increasing its armor from 40mm to 51 and replacing the 2-pounder gun with a 6-pounder gun. The 2-pounder gun was pretty effective when the tank was first introduced, but it soon became outclassed as the Germans increased their armor technology. Its main advantage was its speed, which it needed to get close enough to the German tanks for its gun to be able to penetrate them. It could reach a speed of 24 kilometers off-road and 42 kilometers on roads, which is slightly faster than the Panzer III and significantly faster than what the Panzer IV could achieve. It was one of the most widely produced British tanks during the war. Around 5,300 tanks were built from 1940 to 1943, which is similar to the production numbers of other iconic British tanks like the Churchill and the Cromwell. Alright, up next, another British tank, the Churchill. More specifically, the Churchill Mark VII. I just love the way the Churchill looks. It is such a solid looking tank with these massive side skirts and tracks, very boxy and distinctly British design. It was envisioned as an infantry tank, which is a type of role tanks veered off from during the Second World War as they became more and more powerful. The role of an infantry tank is, as you'd expect, to support the infantry, which means it doesn't really need to go very fast, just fast enough to keep up with the advancing troops. So the Churchill was quite a slow tank with a top speed of only 24 kilometers per hour, but that wasn't really a problem for its intended role in the battlefield. And one of the reasons for this lack of speed is that it was quite heavily armored. The early models had 102mm frontal armor and 76mm on its side, with the Mark VII being upgraded to a whopping 152mm of armor on its front and 95 on its sides. To put this into perspective, the King Tiger had 185mm at its thickest point and the Panther and Tiger had 100, so quite a lot of armor on the Churchill. What's also cool about the Churchill is that the chassis was also used for a variety of different specialist tanks. Perhaps most famous of these is the flamethrower variant, which is actually playable in Battlefield 5, but they were also fitted with mortars, bridge building contraptions, and of course the turretless gun carrier version. I'd love to see this tank in Hell Let Loose if the British ever make it into the game. It is such a distinctive looking tank, designed under a totally different ideology from most tanks of that time period, and I think it would fit the game very well. Alright, moving on the Panzer III, and this is maybe my favorite tank of all time. I've always enjoyed playing this tank in pretty much every game it's been on, and I just love the way it looks. This is the Panzer IV's younger, smaller brother, but in fact, when the Panzer IV was first introduced, it was armed with a howitzer cannon, which is the short barrel that you see sometimes, for the intended purpose of providing a support role. The Panzer III was supposed to be the tank destroyer tank, armed with armor-piercing rounds, while the Panzer IV would engage fortified targets with its howitzer and HE rounds. Obviously, this didn't last too long, as by 1942 the Panzer IV had become the main platform for several vehicles and upgrades, such as the Jagdpanzer IV, the Sturmpanzer, and the Wirbelwind, as it proved to be more suitable for upgrading than the more limited chassis of the Panzer III. Though the Panzer III was outmatched by the armament of the Russian T-34s and even early British tanks and American tanks, other factors such as better crew training and communication meant it still outperformed these in combat. Overall, it's a solid medium tank that was widely used throughout the war, especially during the first few years, so that's not really the setting of Hell Let Loose, but I'd still like to see this tank make an appearance. Alright, up next, the single most produced tank of the war, the T-34. This Russian tank was called by one German general as the finest tank in the world. I would highly recommend that you watch the Tank Museum's video on the T-34, as it goes over the tank's development and it's quite an interesting story. The T-34 was definitely ahead of its time, primarily due to its signature use of sloped armor. Using sloped armor allows a tank's effective armor thickness to increase without having to deal with the added weight and material cost of actually putting on more armor. More weight also means a slower tank, and the weight also strains the entire system, such as the tracks, so using less armor more effectively is obviously a better solution, and it would soon become the norm for pretty much every single tank in the future. The T-34 is also a uniquely Soviet tank, and by that I mean it had reliability problems, which ranged from bad welding, which would let in the rain and would mess up with the electronics inside the tank, to armor flakes coming off when the armor was hit by enemy shells due to the use of low quality steel. These flakes would basically become projectiles inside the tank and would wound the crew, which, by the way, were completely cramped with very little space to move around properly. This lack of crew comfort or accommodations would remain a Russian staple basically forever, as Cold War tanks also sacrificed crew space to keep tank size small and give them a lower profile. The amount of T-34s produced is just absolutely insane. Over 80,000 T-34 and T-34-85s were produced. The T-34-85, by the way, has an 85mm cannon. Nothing really comes even close. Shermans, you're looking at around 50,000 tanks. Panzer IVs, around 8,000. They were literally pumping these out at a faster rate that they could train the crews at. This obviously further impacted reliability as factories cut corners to streamline production, but despite these problems, the tank was so successful, it kept being produced after the war, and it is still used to this day by 9 countries, and was used at some point by around 40 different countries. It is by far the most influential tank of World War II, maybe the single most influential tank of all time, considering the massive impact that this had on the battlefield. I can't wait to use these in Hell Let Loose once the Soviet army rolls out. This is the only tank in this list that I know for sure is coming to the game. Before I move on to the last tank on the list, I want to give an honorable mention to the Stug. The only reason this isn't on the list is because it's a tank destroyer, not an actual tank. So yeah, the Stug is also one of the more iconic vehicles of World War II, I think. And I would just love to see these in the game, and tank destroyers in general as well. Not sure if we'll ever see something like this, but I would personally love to see maybe some maps focusing on wide-scale tank battles with little to no infantry. Alright, last on the list, or maybe I should say first on the list, is the Panzer IV. Yes, it's not the Maus or the King Tiger or any of those crazy German prototype tanks that never made it into production. There's actually one of those already in the game if you haven't noticed. There's a rat or rate or something in Hurtgen Forest just outside the playable area, but getting back to the point, the Panzer IV is just really missing in Hell Let Loose. I would have loved to be in whatever meeting took place when they were thinking about which tanks to bring into the game, because the Panzer IV seems like the obvious choice for the Germans, and instead we have the Panther and the Tiger, which, while also widely known, are both heavy tanks and both very similar tanks. So Germans don't actually have a medium tank. I mean, they do, but they're using the Panther as a medium tank, and that's not really what the Panther was at all. In any case, the Panzer IV was the main tank of the German army during the war. There's a ton of different variations of this tank with different main guns, different armor upgrades, and so on, which would be very cool to see at least, one or two different versions of this tank in the game. Maybe as different options for the commander to field, or just have them be map dependent or something. The Panzer IV would also be a proper German medium to go against the Sherman tanks, which I think would actually go a long way towards achieving better balance in terms of armor, since at the moment both the Panther and the Tiger are basically nerfed compared to their real-life counterparts, and the Shermans are significantly buffed, especially the base Sherman model, which had basically no chance of facing either the Panther or the Tiger head-on. Why the Panzer IV isn't in the game is a great mystery to me, since, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like such an obvious choice, almost mandatory in fact. Out of all the tanks in this list, most of which we shouldn't ever see in the game unless the British Army is added at some point, this is the one I really want to see. Alright, that's the list, my list of the top 5 tanks that I want to see in the game. I'm interested to see what you guys think, so leave a comment down below with the 5 tanks that you want to see added to Hell Let Loose. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope I will catch you in the next one.